Good morning. Our lesson this morning begins in the 12th verse of Isaiah 9. Isaiah 9, verse 12. Ned, would you word a prayer for us?
Dear loving Heavenly Father, Lord, we're so thankful for this Lord's Day that we have to come and have fellowship, gather together once again. We pray, Lord, you'll be with us this morning, that we will be able to learn and apply these things to our lives, and we can let our lives shine for you. We pray, Lord, for those who are sick who can't be here, we pray that they might have a portion of their health restored so they can be with us. We pray for those who have chosen not to be here. We pray for our nation, Lord, at this time, that we will continue to be a God-fearing nation. Watch over us, forgive us of our sins. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. We haven't had class for 2 weeks. We had a guest speaker last Sunday morning, so we need to refresh our minds about what's going on here in Isaiah. Isaiah was primarily, his message was primarily to Judah, the southern tribes. However, he obviously, in the scheme of things, in order to instruct Judah, he talks a lot about the Samaritan area, the northern tribes, the capital of which was at Samaria. He really hones in on their evil nature. And as we begin our session here this morning, beginning with 9:12, he says, "The Syrians before and the Philistines behind, and they shall devour Israel with open mouth." And notice the next sentence. "For all this his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still." Now that thought was expressed in the 5th chapter of Isaiah, and it is expressed 3 more times in the next few verses. Let's look at that thought. "For all this his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still." Stretched out still. Hand is stretched out still. What's that kind of tell you? His hand is stretched out still. It wasn't as if his hands were folded, right? It wasn't as if he was just, oh, well, okay, I'll let this pass. We'll not worry about this. Now, so at least 4 times he uses that expression, that refrain. Now, I guess in poetry and music you'd call that a refrain. It's a thought, a message that's reoccurring. And here he has, at least, and we'll look at that, and then we'll come back. We'll look at the overall, and then we'll come back. Following or leading up to verse 12, Isaiah talked about in 8 to 12, 8 through 11, Isaiah talked about the egotistical attitude of Israel, of Ephraim. A lot of it was kind of like, as we noted last week or 2 weeks ago, it was kind of like, so we're being punished, we're being in disarray, but we're going to build bigger things. We're going to do, and he used the illustration there. We're going to replace bricks with stone. In other words, we're going to, as a social order, we're going to be really, we're suffering punishment. Probably God's behind the punishment, but we're going to be better. Well, what is Isaiah's answer to that, well, for all of this, his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. Okay, in the next section, we got an overview of the next few verses. Isaiah pronounces judgment against the error of false leadership, of priests, of religious leaders that are, off track. And then he comes there in verse 17. Here's the refrain again. For all this, his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. Well, then, in 9:18 to 21, Isaiah pronounces judgment against the internal discord in the society. When a nation has enemies, and when there's when the leadership of the nation makes a policy decision, not everyone's going to agree with that. I think Vietnam was kind of the poster child for that, right? This country made a decision to fight communism in Vietnam. Well, you know what happened. I guess, Ned, you're old enough to remember. You were just coming along at that time. But we had internal strife over that policy decision, and that internal strife was so vehement that policy changed. Well, there were riots within our social order. So you can imagine what was going on, when there was this conflict. Here was this Assyrian superpower out there, and they were gobbling up the nations around about. They were moving in to the northern tribes, about to take away the northern tribes. But that wasn't going to satisfy the Assyrians. They were coming after Judah as well. And so in that verse 17, at the end of the verse, that same refrain. And then judgment against, internal discord, as we said. And then in the first 4 verses of chapter 10, and by the way, probably those 4 verses probably should have been assigned to chapter 9. Somebody made some arbitrary decisions as to how the verses and chapters were assigned. Originally, there were no chapter and verse designations in the original manuscripts, obviously. But in the first 4 verses against chapter 10, Isaiah points out the problem with the ethical, moral standards. And for example, just there, he says in verse 2, he talks, and we'll come back to this later, that they take a right. The government was taking away the right from the poor of my people, that widows may be their prey. In other words, civil government, or what the government that related to, ordinary discourse, ordinary, living, was bad policy. Now, we've got some bad policy in this country. And this might sound political, and it's not political. But when 1% of the people are way up here in terms of economics, and everybody else is down below. When half of the wealth of this country is in the hands of, a few folks, that has to do with policy. I mean, there are policy decisions that, and this has nothing to do with Democrat, Republican necessarily. I'm just saying that policy favors, from time to time, certain people. Well, policy in that era, with that group of Jews, policy was not good for the widows and the poor. And God doesn't like that too much. And so in verse 4, he says, "For all this, his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still." That refrain comes back. There's a message, then a refrain. A stanza, and then a refrain. Okay. Going back then to verse 12. "The Syrians before, and the Philistines behind, and they shall devour Israel with open mouth." Just as a matter of, drawing on your world history, what kind of people were those Assyrians? Peace-loving, kind, generous.
Vicious.
Huh?
They were vicious, cruel.
Yeah, it was either them or the Persian kings, probably the Persian kings. I don't know, one of that bunch used to skin people alive. Which group was that? Persians. I mean, that's the kind of, and use the skin for a footstool. That's the kind of cruelty that was inherent in these social orders. Now, we're going to get in. We're going to see how this plays out. But why did God use the Assyrians as an instrument against what had been his own people? He used them as a tool. He used those as a tool to punish his own people. Well, what had been his own people, you see. But they didn't know God was using them as a tool necessarily. They were just a vicious, torturous group. "The Syrians before and the Philistines behind, and they shall devour Israel with open mouth." In verse 13, "For the people turneth not unto him that smite them, neither do they seek the Lord of hosts. Therefore the Lord will cut off from Israel head and tail, branch and rush in one day." Now, when he says he'll cut off head and tail and branch and rush in one day, what's the is this going to be a long, drawn-out process? Whoa, in one day? I mean, that expression there, in one day, this is going to be a military action against Israel is going to be swift. That's the idea of one day there. Now the head and tail. Head and tail. Head and tail. The victims are going to both be head and tail. What's that mean? Head and tail. Pardon me? Well, it's it's a metaphor. What? Leaders. Heads. The religious leaders were really bad, and we might refer to them as the tail. But the idea here is that this catastrophe is not going to miss anybody. It's going to hit everybody. Everybody's going to be a victim. Yeah, it's nobody's going to be missed. No one's going to be missed. The ancient and the honorable, he's the head. And the prophets that lies, that teaches lies, he's the tail. Everybody. It's kind of interesting that the false prophets are considered the tail, in this metaphor. Well, that really puts a lot of, that really puts a lot of weight on those that teach, right? When Mark preaches that there's a heavy weight on him to ensure that what he's preaching is truth. Anybody that teaches, there's a lot of weight on those persons to teach the truth. I mean, it's a heavy burden, it's a heavy responsibility. Becky?
So it says the elder and honorable are the head.
Yeah.
So everybody's going to get even honorable?
Well,
Like my father used to say, I'm going to get all three and make sure I get the right one.
I have no clue as to what you're talking about because I was a good boy. Well, the indication here is that everybody.
The word honorable there doesn't mean honorable with God. In other words, they were the upper class. They were the...
Also, like, the people honor them, they weren't necessarily classy people.
And they were just the upper class, kind of maybe the leaders of that day, politicians or whatever we would call them.
Yeah.
But they weren't honorable in the sight of God.
It was, there were people that were supposed to be. The priests were supposed to be truthful. The honorable people were supposed to be effectuating good policy for people. Well, they missed the mark. Everybody's going to be affected here.
Bill, I think for today's lesson, for today's time, it shows that the leaders led and the people weren't given a pass because they were misleading. The world we live in today, all the false religious leaders who are leading millions astray, they're all, the ones who are being led astray aren't going to get off because they were taught wrong on them too.
Right, because the information is available.
Right?
And when we try to tell it, they just shut us down. Or it's someone telling them false things, they're just why, oh yeah, tell me more. Because it sounds good. It's too easy.
Yeah, I think that the important point is nobody's going to be left off the hook, right? And when you when you see politics play out on U.S. soil, you got to just shake your head sometime. I mean, you really just have to think, did he really say that? Did he really mean that? Did she really say that? I'm thinking of political leaders. And let's face it, in our country today, it's not about the people. It's about who's going to maintain the power. Any way you cut it, that's what it's... And it's getting worse all the time. So, it's and you can imagine what kind of a social order they had. For the leaders of this people cause them to err, and they that are led of them are destroyed. You see, they that are led of them, okay? And that's what Ned was saying. And obviously, you know, people in a nation, people in a society, in a community are kind of like sheep, right? Isn't that right? Most people, and I'm not speaking of Bible-believing people, but most people are just kind of like sheep. When some of the sins were so egregious in the minds of people that didn't even talk about them. You know, people generally, they generally were of that view. But then when people started coming out of the closet, so to speak, and when the people in high places, you know, say, well, that's okay, what happens to most of the people? They just follow along. You know, just follow the polls. They just kind of follow like dumb sheep. Unless, of course, one is steeped in Scripture. And make no mistake, those kind of things are permeating even the church, where preachers are instructed not to preach about certain things. I mean, within a congregation, some preachers are instructed, now we're not going to hit this topic. Is that right, Mark? We're not. Yeah, I know you don't get any flack from us, but yeah. Here's a list of subjects here, preacher. Don't deal with that. Don't deal with these subjects. Here's a list of them right here. Well, that's an indication of how the world has permeated the religious community. Therefore, in verse 17, the Lord shall have no joy in their young men, neither shall have mercy on their fatherless and widows. For everyone is a hypocrite and an evildoer, and every mouth speaketh folly. Now, he's talking here about, you know, the condition of northern Israel, but couldn't he find somebody that was not an evildoer? Couldn't he find somebody that didn't speak folly?
Maybe, but nobody was there like Abraham, Moses,
To lead. But you'd have, you know, a society that's so bad that there's not even a few people that are decent. Is that what they're saying here? I think with regard to northern Israel, you couldn't find a good person with a search warrant looking for them. I mean, isn't that pathetic? Now, compare that to Judah. There was going to be a remnant come back from Babylonian captivity when the Persians took over, right? There was a remnant. But of northern Israel, is there any indication that there was a remnant that came back from that Assyrian captivity. There's no indication that there was anybody that was interested in things religious, interested in God. Is that right? Am I missing something here? Was there a remnant? Was there a remnant that came back from northern Israel when they were carried away into captivity? Pardon me? Southern Israel, Judah. But that had to do with Judah, right? As far as, pardon me? Yeah, I think that's the point. There was in northern Israel, there weren't even a few that were worthy of, or felt that they ought to come back. But, pretty pathetic situation there. Therefore, the Lord shall have no joy in their young men, neither shall have mercy on their fatherless and the widows. For everyone is a hypocrite and an evildoer, and every mouth speaketh folly. And so here's this refrain now. For all this, his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. Now, Isaiah having said that, now he goes into another thought, a series of thoughts with regard to the nature of that civilization. For wickedness burneth as the fire, and it devour the briars and thorns, and shall kindle in the thickets of the forest, and they shall mount up like the lifting up of smoke. Now that's a metaphor for the condition of the society, the civil community, the communities there. And what's the metaphor there? For wickedness burneth as the fire. What does that verse remind you of? Yeah. Doesn't it remind you of a vast forest fire? And how bad is in the western United States when there's a big forest fire, or even in the eastern United States. Yeah. I mean, that's you visualize, man, that's, wind taking, going, 40, 50 miles an hour? I mean, you can be, well, that's how bad wickedness was, right? That's how bad wickedness was in this society. I mean, it was rampant. I think somebody used the word, it was rampant. It was horribly like the lifting of the smoke. Just think, you visualize that forest fire, and this is how bad the social order was. Then verse 19, through the wrath of the Lord, the wrath of the Lord of hosts, in the land darkened, and the people shall be as the fuel of the fire. No man shall spare his brother. What he's conveying here is this whole idea that it was just a horrible society where the people shall be as fuel for fire. It's kind of like, a fire destroys the whole forest. Well, the social order is so bad that people are destroying one another. Think Chicago. Think some inner cities where people are destroying one another, right? And no man shall spare his brother. I mean, there isn't enough fraternal, brotherly. There's just no concern for human life. I mean, in some particular communities in the world, some countries in the world, some communities within the United States, there's just no respect for human life. I mean, it was that kind of a social situation. In verse 20, and he shall snatch on the right hand, and he shall snatch or seek for on the right hand and be hungry, and he shall eat on the left hand, and they shall not be satisfied. They shall eat every man the flesh of his own arm. Now, what's that mean? I mean, the social order is just what? It's so bad that everybody's devouring. I mean, it's just a horrible existence. Can't trust anybody. People killing one another, brothers, fathers. You know, it's just a horrible situation. And then he goes on and he talks about Manasseh and Ephraim. You know, and Ephraim and Manasseh. These Ephraim being kind of a euphemism for Israel. And they together shall be against Judah. Wait a minute. From time to time, did northern Israel want to attack their brethren in Judah, in Jerusalem? They did. And in fact, history indicates that northern Israel was making a deal, tried to make a deal with Syria against Assyria, and wanted Judah to go along with them, and Judah didn't go along with them, and so they attacked Judah. So this just indicates that there was conflict between northern Israel and Judah. Now, and then he uses this refrain again. For all this, his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. Now, another message with the refrain at the end of verse 4. Woe unto them that decree unrighteous decrees, and that write grievances which they have prescribed. Woe unto them that decree unrighteous decrees, and that write grievousness which they have prescribed. Now, what's he talking about there about decrees? Decrees.
Political leaders were making unjust, unrighteous laws binding on the people.
Yeah. Political leaders were making unjust laws to govern the people. Now, that was a horrible situation. Now, usually a society, or typically a society, should take care of those that are most vulnerable, right? And who typically are most vulnerable? Widows, orphans, in that society in particular, widows and orphans. You suppose in that society, would there be anybody that would have thought of having a children's home, an orphanage, a place to protect the widows? Now think about that a minute. You know, at least we have institutions, civil institutions and religious institutions that, have hospitals, orphanages, or children's homes. We have, a variety of things that protect the vulnerable. Pardon me? Well, and Nikki, for in the main, there have been good.
I mean, that's the idea, but then you get people in there, which is a whole different story.
Yeah.
That do their own thing.
Yeah, unfortunately, humans have to operate the institutions. That's what you're saying. And sometimes they don't do a very good job of operating the institutions. But for the most part, well, the bottom line is they weren't thinking of having, their policies didn't foster, orphan homes and, that sort of thing. They had unrighteous decrees that right grievousness which they have prescribed. They made laws to do bad things to their own people.
Mine says misfortune, that writes
I'm sorry?
Mine says, uses the word misfortune, you write misfortune,
Okay.
which is horrible.
So, if the laws are unjust, if the laws say it's okay to steal, if the laws say it's okay to murder, excuse me, then the social order's in really bad shape. To turn aside the needy, verse 2, from judgment, and to take away the right from the poor of my people, that widows may be their prey, and that they may rob the fatherless. James said, pure religion and undefiled before God. Somebody finish that. Pardon me? Yeah. Well, let me. Pure religion undefiled before God. Now, it's kind of interesting. James comes up with an interesting, kind of a pair of things. Pure religion undefiled before God is to visit the fatherless and the widows. Now, okay, so that's just basic. It's just basic, to help those that are vulnerable, but then keep unspotted from the world. That pretty much sizes up a person's responsibility to God, doesn't it? Be compassionate, considerate, helper to society, and then what else? Keep yourself unspotted.
I find it very interesting that we look at Scripture, we see that governments have authority from God. But even in this book, and of course through the minor prophets, we continue to see the leaders who abuse that leadership privilege and do not walk in the authority of God, though they
Yeah, God authorizes civil government. And civil government, being in a civil government position of leadership, carries a weight of responsibility. God would expect them. God institutes government to do what? To protect and to keep people from being murdered. And so God expects civil government to be just and expects the people that are in civil government to be honest and have integrity and Herschel?
Yeah, but it appears that not only they expect it to be unfortunate ones, but they will be stealing the little they have.
You know, what? Herschel brings up really a good point here. They took advantage of the vulnerability of the folks, right? What did Jesus say about the religious people of his day in that with that regard? Now, I remember this is not covering new ground here, but what did Jesus say about the Pharisees? Yeah, they robbed, so to speak. They robbed the vulnerable.
Well, some things have never changed, but that's going on to this day. That little 1% you're talking about. We're supposed to protect our elderly, and they're the first ones that 1% is taken it from to keep their little 1%. Not trying to get political. Saying.
Yeah, we're not going to get political here, but you're right. I mean, since humans operate civil institutions, and since some humans are more corrupt than others, in the administration of civil matters, sometimes the most vulnerable are taken advantage of.
And these are the people that they somehow tricked into supporting them. And then they're the first ones that they turned on, and they still don't even feel it.
To turn aside the needy from judgment and to take away the right from the poor of my people, that widows may be their prey. And that's what the Pharisees were all about. The widows would be their prey. And that they may rob the fatherless. And what will ye do in the day of visitation in Isaiah 10:3? And what will ye do in the day of visitation and in the desolation which shall come from far? To whom will ye flee for help? And where will you leave your glory? Now, there's a lot in that verse. First of all, what's the day of visitation? And in this case, it's going to be, for northern Israel, it's going to be the Assyrian military. Okay. And to whom will ye flee for help? They weren't depending on God for their help. So